Many movies tackle mental health with varying degrees of success. Depression affects almost 1 in 5 people worldwide. It's an illness which doesn't care how much money you have, what your ethnicity is, where you're from, what your religion is. It can affect you anytime and anywhere. Yet generally speaking, public awareness of the condition, its symptoms and its management is poor. This is in part due to a woefully poor understanding and representation of mental health in the entertainment industry, with many movies and TV shows treating the issue as a funny character quirk, or a temporary inconvenience that a bit of dancing can fix. The Babadook is the 2014 movie written and directed by Jennifer Kent, about a mother named Amelia and her struggle to raise her son Sam in the wake of the death of her husband, whilst also being terrorised by a malevolent entity. At least, that's how it appears on first glance, but it's also the best and most complete representation of depression. Whether on purpose or by accident, I think the vicious spirit which attacks and haunts Amelia and Sam is a metaphor for clinical depression. If this isn't enough, it's also an excellent depiction of the effects of sleep deprivation too. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders defines the symptoms of depression as the following: depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. Significant weight loss when not dieting, or weight gain or decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day. A slowing down of thought and a reduction of physical movement, but this has to be observed by others, not just the subjective individual. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day. Diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness nearly every day. Recurrent thoughts of death, recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan, or a suicide attempt or a specific plan for committing suicide. There's a lot of movies about depression or featuring depressed characters, but I think they miss the mark. They show us what Hollywood thinks depressed people look like. They're just people that are upset. The Babadook does more than that. Throughout the movie, almost from the very start, we can see that Amelia suffers from a depressed mood, and there isn't always an obvious reason for it. It's not just sadness, it ranges between genuine despair and a complete absence of anything at all. We also see her having a greatly diminished enjoyment of motherhood and life in general. She seems like an empty shell of a person struggling to muster even the slightest bit of enjoyment in her life. Close to the beginning, one of her co-workers points out how exhausted she looks and acts, and on occasion she struggles to even move from bed when it's necessary. Despite it being nobody's fault, she feels guilt at the death of her husband, and then later she feels guilt about how difficult her son is, and her inability to control him. This leads to a feeling of worthlessness in herself and creates a great deal of anxiety. At times, she struggles to think coherently and has trouble making real decisions, which only serves to exacerbate the other issues in her life. Amelia is almost a textbook clinical definition of depression from start to finish. What makes it more fascinating is that the depression is shown at first as creeping symptoms. It'd be easy to simply dismiss the symptoms or ignore them, pass them off as byproducts of her difficult situation. I see the symptoms, however, as a demonstration of a more clinical problem, a problem which she's managed to control, barely, for most of her life. And the monster, Mr. Babadook, is the visual manifestation of the moment her depression finally takes hold of her. While some may disagree with my theory, I think it's very telling that the Babadook doesn't begin to terrorise Amelia until she willingly brings the book into the house. Up until that point, she's resisted the depression, and so she has not experienced any of these attacks. But from the point that she finally lets her guard down, she begins to be assaulted by the monster. This isn't unlike how people suffering with depression often describe their first descents into it. It's rarely described as a single catastrophic day, and more commonly a series of feelings, situations and events which creep up on you without you even realising that it's happening. The description of the Babadook's effects on its victim in the book even mirror the types of effects that major clinical depression has on its sufferers. Denial is a powerful factor in why so many people suffering from depression end up at their lowest ebb, at breaking point. Most mental health disorders affect the personality of the person suffering from it. They start to act in unusual, confusing and aggressive ways, just like how the Babadook affects people. What separates the Babadook even further from all other movies featuring mental health is that it doesn't just perfectly represent the clinical definition of depression, it also explores the mechanics behind depression. The movie carefully presents the issue as a very complex one with many contributing factors. It opens with a car accident, one which Amelia survives but her husband Oscar doesn't. The logical conclusion to draw is that the loss of her husband sends her into a spiral of grief from which she never really escapes, and this is what causes her depression. Later in the film, however, we learn that this is not the extent of the issue. In fact, the accident happened because Oscar was driving Amelia to the hospital because she was in labour with Sam. So although it's not explicitly said, in her heavily grief-stricken state, Amelia has linked the two events in her mind. Oscar died because Sam was born. This was further amplified by the horror and guilt that Amelia feels because she subconsciously and consciously blames Sam for the loss of the one thing she cared the most about, something that Sam is aware of.
My dad's in the cemetery. He got killed driving Mum to the hospital to have me. Samuel.
Psychologist John Bowlby founded the theory of attachment. His research proved that during the early years of a child's development, from babies all the way to being late toddlers, contact and emotional connection with a primary caregiver was extremely important for social, emotional and psychological development. Without it, the subjects in the experiment developed high levels of anxiety and aggression, which they retained all the way into adulthood. The grief that Amelia experienced, and the fact that she linked that to the birth of her son, prevented her from developing this attachment with her son. Instead of seeing Sam as something to be treasured, nurtured and protected, she often sees him as an antagonist, a source of pain and a horrible reminder of the death of her husband. The prevention of this attachment is a contributing factor in Sam's aggressive and unusual behaviour. He's developed it as a defence mechanism against a harsh world, because from his perspective he's not had a carer or protector like the other children he knows. This idea is reinforced later, as the recovery from her depression is triggered when that attachment to Sam finally begins to connect.
I know you don't love me. The Babadook won't let you. But I love you, Mum.
People suffering from depression, when at their most depressed, often contemplate thoughts of suicide, and one of the main reasons they reach this point is because of a lack of a social network to help them through this period when things don't seem like they will ever improve. For Amelia and Sam, their social support structure is either damaged or completely removed by Sam's aggressive behaviour. It gets him kicked out of school, it gets him ostracised by the other kids, and it's the reason that Amelia loses her only support structure, her sister. This is how depression happens. It's not an enormous, dramatic event which destroys your life in one swoop. It's a gradual and painful erosion of all your support structures and everything you enjoy. Though science still doesn't have solid explanations about sleep, what we do know is that after a few days without sleep, sufferers enter a period of sleep psychosis. The body forces the conscious mind to shut down for a minute or two, and you experience a kind of waking dream, where you might experience visual and auditory hallucinations. The lack of sleep can also make you behave in ways which are out of character. Sometimes maybe even dangerous. From pretty much the opening minute, we can see Amelia is suffering from sleep deprivation. This becomes more and more extreme as the movie goes on. The Babadook attacks could be the result of that sleep psychosis, just visual and auditory hallucinations. This deprivation and psychosis begins to erode her personality too, until she starts to seem like a danger to her own son. The reason I've highlighted the very accurate representation of sleep psychosis is because this too is both a cause and effect of the depression. The previously mentioned subconscious animosity that she has towards Sam causes him to behave badly, which causes her to be sleep deprived and eventually in a state of sleep psychosis, which again causes her to behave erratically towards him, which causes his behaviour to be even worse. It's a vicious and damaging cycle which constantly perpetuates and accelerates itself. There is no other movie, besides The Babadook, which approaches the management of depression in a realistic and accurate way. All other movies present it as a disease with a cure, and that cure is a pill or a few hours in a psychiatrist's office. People suffering from depression often say that it's the love and non-judgmental attitude of close friends and loved ones which help them break the cycle and see things from a different perspective. Unlike other movies, The Babadook doesn't show Amelia triumphing over her depression. Instead, it takes a much more realistic approach. At the end of the movie, the monster isn't vanquished so they can live happily ever after. The monster is kept, trapped in the basement, and Amelia takes worms to feed to it. This is symbolic in a number of ways. Firstly, the basement is representative of her subconscious. The monster, or depression, is always there. It's never cured or eliminated. In the real treatment of clinical depression, patients are always said to be in remission, where the condition is managed, but they're never cured. Amelia feeding worms to the monster is also symbolic. In nature, the job of worms is to turn soil and process the decaying matter into healthy and nutrient-rich soil for plants. The job of psychology in the treatment of depression is to turn and process unhealthy thoughts and feelings into something we can accept. She manages the Babadook by feeding it something whose job it is to turn decayed matter into something acceptable and useful. This is a clear parallel with the treatment of depression. There's a fundamental lack of understanding by the general public about depression. We always think that it's something that people can just get over, without ever really considering the intricate and tragic circumstances behind it. The Babadook shows us what depression really looks like, and now that you've seen what it looks like and why it happens, I hope the next time you see someone who may be suffering, you might ask how you can help.